Okay, let's dive straight in. We're tackling a really complex topic today, looking at the ripple effects of big global decisions. Specifically, we're doing a deep dive into the potential negative impacts right here on the United States, from sanctions imposed against Russia.
Hmm.
This deep dive, it's built around a specific source you shared with us, excerpts from a piece called Sanctions Against Russia, a U.S. Economic Reckoning. And we're really focusing tightly on this section labeled Why Bone-Crushing Sanctions Against Russia Are Harmful for the USA.
Right.
So
Oh,
our mission here, it's clear, to walk through the arguments presented within this source about how sanctions, designed to pressure Russia, might potentially, well, boomerang back and create significant challenges for the United States and for you, the listener. We're here to unpack this source's perspective, not debate it, just understand what it leaves out.
that's absolutely cute. I mean, sanctions are a major tool, right, in international policy. But their consequences, well, they're rarely simple, often debated. This specific source takes a clear stance by focusing on the potential costs borne by the country imposing them, the U.S. in this case.
Yeah.
So think of us as guides exploring the arguments this particular piece makes, presenting its case for why these sanctions could be harmful for the U.S.
All right, let's get right into what this source sees as the first major concern: direct economic risks to the U.S. economy. The source sets the stage by reminding us the U.S. economy was already dealing with inflation and supply chain issues before these specific intensified sanctions against Russia really took hold.
Yeah, that context is important.
And here's where the source throws in a potentially, well, eye-opening detail. It mentions a proposed 500% tariff. Yeah, 500% on imports from countries that keep buying Russian energy, like oil, gas, or uranium.
Wow. 500%. And according to this source, a tariff like that isn't just about those specific imports. It creates these huge ripple effects. The piece argues this would severely disrupt global trade, especially with a giant partner like China, which, is a major buyer of Russian energy.
Right.
The source claims this disruption could translate directly into higher prices for you as a consumer, new bottlenecks in already fragile supply chains, and maybe even job losses as industries relying on those now incredibly expensive imports face, well, serious trouble.
The source also spends a good chunk of time on the energy side of things. It points out that the U.S. isn't entirely cut off. It relies on Russian-enriched uranium for some of its nuclear power generation.
Hmm.
So the argument from this source is that disrupting that specific supply could mean facing energy shortages or, higher costs specifically for your electricity bill.
Yeah, and what this piece does is connect that to the bigger picture, like how sanctions targeting Russian oil exports, even indirectly, have already contributed to significant volatility in global oil prices. It gives that specific detail, right? In 2022, oil prices jumped over $100 a barrel, first time since 2014.
Wow.
And the source links that partly to these sanctions. The source argues that when energy costs surge like that, it doesn't just stay there, it hits everything: transportation, manufacturing costs, your home heating, gas prices.
Uh,
It squeezes businesses and households alike.
And the source highlights what it sees as a pretty striking unintended consequence already playing out back in 2022. It notes that while Russia's overall economy did shrink, I think it was 2.1%,
Yeah, that's the figure it cites.
those sky-high energy prices actually ended up boosting its revenues, kind of helping the country withstand the initial shock of the sanctions.
Which presents a sharp contrast, according to the source, with what was happening here in the U.S. during that same time. The piece points out the U.S. saw inflation soar, right? The CPI, that key measure of how much things cost you, hit 7.9% in February 2022.
Mm-hmm. A 40-year high, wasn't it?
Well, it was heading towards that territory, definitely a major spike. And the source's argument is that this was significantly worsened by those global energy price spikes. And pushing further sanctions, it argues, could just intensify that pressure on the U.S. economy because global energy markets were already tight.
Okay, so shifting gears a bit. The source also makes a strong case that these sanctions risk damaging relationships with some of the world's major economies.
Yeah.
It specifically warns about alienating key international partners, including both, traditional allies and big emerging markets.
Right. This source gets into the details about the impact on China and India. It argues that since both are major buyers of Russian energy, they could face severe penalties, like that proposed 500% tariff.
Which sounds extreme.
It does, and the source claims this could potentially lead to the U.S. just halting trade with them. The warning about China is particularly stark. It's a critical supplier for the U.S. economy, And the source claims a trade war sparked by these sanctions could be devastating for supply chains, dramatically hike costs for, well, everything imported, and probably provoke painful retaliatory tariffs from China.
And it brings up India, too, which the source describes as a vital strategic partner, especially in Asia. The argument there is that if India faced punitive measures over its energy buys, it might, scale back cooperation with the U.S.
Which the source argues could undermine U.S. efforts to counterbalance China in that region, so it's got geopolitical implications too.
Yeah.
The source also looks at European allies. It points out many European nations are still heavily reliant on Russian natural gas. And even if there are potential exemptions and sanction proposals, the source argues Europe's continued need for this energy just highlights the difficulty.
Right. The reality on the ground.
Exactly. The piece suggests the U.S. risks isolating itself if it imposes these secondary sanctions on countries that are basically just prioritizing their own energy security. And that could weaken cooperative efforts like the REPO task force, which was focused on seizing Russian assets.
The source also argues that these sanctions aren't really isolating Russia in the way may be intended. Instead, they're pushing Russia closer to China and other non-Western powers, effectively creating a significant bloc resistant to U.S. influence. It points to Russia's pivot to Asia and its growing economic reliance on China, claiming this ultimately erodes U.S. geopolitical leverage over the long haul.
And what this piece highlights in the bigger picture is its view that this kind of realignment could speed up a shift towards a more multipolar world, a world where the U.S. finds it harder to exert dominance. It points to the BRICS alliance, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa as a key example.
Yeah, I've seen headlines about them.
Right, and the source notes their active exploration of alternatives to Western-led financial systems.
Yeah.
So seeing this broader shift potentially happening.
Okay, let's really bring this home and make it personal for you, the listener. The source makes a point that the economic fallout it describes wouldn't just be numbers on a screen. It would hit ordinary Americans hardest.
Definitely.
It circles back to how the source says higher energy prices, driven by these market disruptions it links to sanctions, means steeper costs for things you use every single day. Gasoline for your car, heating your home, electricity. It quotes that specific detail. Energy prices in the U.S. rose by 25% in 2022.
A huge jump.
Yeah, directly contributing to the inflation you are already feeling. The source's claim is that further sanctions could seriously worsen this, turning everyday expenses into a real struggle for working families.
And this source also discusses how those supply chain disruptions it mentioned, plus potential tariffs on imports, especially from China, would push up prices on a huge range of goods, electronics, clothes, all sorts of things. It even cites a warning mentioned in the source attributed to Senator Rand Paul.
Oh yeah, what did it say?
Suggesting such measures could trigger, and this is strong language, economic calamity, and potentially send unemployment rates climbing towards recession levels.
Wow, calamity. That's quite a warning. The source also expresses particular concern for small businesses. It argues they're already stretched thin, right, by inflation, labor shortages.
Exactly.
And soaring costs for inputs could lead to widespread closures, meaning more job losses and a slowdown in local economies.
And connecting this back to the source's broader view, it also touches on the potential impact on global food markets. The source notes, Russia and Ukraine are major exporters of key stuff like wheat and fertilizers.
Right, the breadbasket issue.
Precisely. It explains the source's perspective that sanctions-related disruptions have already worsened global food insecurity. And while the U.S. is less directly dependent on those specific imports, the source argues that rising global food prices would still likely push up domestic food costs, putting even more pressure on your household grocery budget.
So, circling back to a major theme here, the source clearly sees skyrocketing inflation as a huge risk. It states explicitly that the 2022 sanctions contributed significantly to the global energy and commodity price spikes, playing a role in pushing U.S. inflation towards that 40-year high.
Yeah, it draws a direct link there. And the source then explains how it believes the proposed steeper tariffs would directly amplify this by making a vast range of imported goods from places like China way more expensive.
Right.
It also adds a point about what it calls a structurally depressed dollar, which the source suggests could result from less global demand for the dollar, potentially further increasing import costs and fueling inflation here at home.
Okay, so this situation, according to the source, creates a really tough spot for the Federal Reserve, right? The U.S. central bank.
A real bind.
The source argues that while the Fed might need to raise interest rates aggressively to try and beat back inflation, Doing that carries the significant risk of pushing the economy into recession, sort of like what happened in the 1970s with the oil shocks.
Hmm. That historical parallel.
And the source mentions the Fed was hesitant to tighten policy too quickly in 2022, partly because of these recession fears. A worry, it says, is still around.
So the source's warning is pretty stark. A recession triggered or worsened by sanctions-related disruptions could mean widespread job losses, a sharp drop in consumer spending, a prolonged economic downturn. And the piece specifically notes that, in its view, this kind of impact would disproportionately hurt vulnerable communities.
Okay, finally, let's get to what the source describes as possibly the most significant long-term consequence, speeding up this trend towards de-dollarization.
Yeah, this is a big one. What this source argues here is quite profound. It claims that by, quote, weaponizing the U.S. dollar through sanctions pointing specifically to freezing Russia's foreign reserves and cutting off many Russian banks from SWIFT.
The global payment messaging system, yeah.
Right, back in 2022. The source argues the U.S. sent a powerful signal to other nations, basically, that their own dollar assets or access to the dollar system could potentially be at risk down the line.
And the source gives specific examples of how nations are reportedly reacting to that signal, looking for alternatives. It points to Russia moving towards yuanization of its economy, using more Chinese yuan for trade instead of the dollar. It mentions the BRICS alliance exploring the idea of a potential new common currency to bypass the dollar system, and countries like India using non-dollar currencies like the UAE dirham for some of its oil purchases.
So the source's view is that this encourages countries to diversify their reserves away from the dollar and pushes the development of alternative payment systems that don't rely on U.S. financial infrastructure. And the major consequence this piece points to: a decline in global demand for dollars could weaken the dollar's value.
And for you, listening,
For you, that could mean higher inflation, because imports get more expensive when the dollar is weaker.
the source even presents a more, well, extreme scenario,
Yeah.
suggesting that a sudden, rapid loss of the dollar's status as the world's main reserve currency could potentially trigger hyperinflation and severe economic instability inside the U.S., potentially threatening the country's social fabric.
Which is a very serious claim. And this piece also brings up actions it sees as potentially fueling this trend. It mentions past threats, like those attributed to President Trump, about maybe imposing massive 100% tariffs on countries that trade in non-dollar currencies.
Right.
The source argues that measures like that could inadvertently accelerate de-dollarization as nations just prioritize gaining more economic independence from the U.S. financial system. So the source's conclusion here isn't that the dollar's dominance is vanishing tomorrow.
No, not overnight.
Not overnight,
Yeah.
but that the trend away from it is real and carries significant long-term implications for the U.S.'s financial power and its global standing.
So, pulling back to summarize the key arguments we've unpacked from this source, it makes the case that what it calls bone-crushing sanctions against Russia carry significant potential risks for the United States. The source highlights potential direct economic harm tariffs, energy costs strained global relationships with key partners like China and India, real negative impacts on ordinary Americans facing higher costs, and job worries. The risk of fueling that skyrocketing inflation that could maybe trigger recession and perhaps most consequentially long-term, accelerating that global shift away from relying on the U.S. dollar.
That's the core of the source's perspective. Its overarching argument is that these powerful measures aimed at weakening the Kremlin carry substantial risks and potential, collateral damage, not just for the target country, but directly for the U.S. economy, its citizens, and its global standing. And it's crucial, like we said at the start, to remember this is one specific analysis presenting a case about potential negative effects. Sanctions are complex, their impacts widely debated.
Absolutely. And that leads us to the final sort of provocative thought this source leaves for you to consider. It suggests that policymakers really need to carefully weigh these potential risks, balancing the goal of countering aggression with the equally vital goal of preserving U.S. economic stability and its influence in the world.
Yeah.
The source proposes considering alternative approaches, maybe more targeted sanctions combined with diplomacy, instead of these broad measures, it argues, could end up isolating the U.S. more than Russia.
A different strategic calculation?
Right. So the big question this source really puts on the table is, when using powerful economic tools like sanctions, what is the right balance? And what are the true costs, the intended and unintended ones, not just for the nation being targeted, but for the nation choosing to impose them? This particular piece certainly gives you a lot of specific points and arguments to think about as you consider that question.